Today we're going to look at a time period which we call the Gilded Age. And we talked about before the Civil War about expansion and this belief of manifest destiny and how America was spreading from coast to coast. And that didn't even really stop during the Civil War. You're going to have Abraham Lincoln giving land grants to the railroad companies. And so even through Reconstruction, people are still expanding. And we really want to link the East Coast to the West Coast because this is going to open up new markets for manufactured goods. It's going to relieve inner city crowding. And the way to do this, of course, is going to be through the use of railroads. And the Gilded Age is going to see a boom in economic activity as we expand westward, especially with the railroad. So we want to look at the railroad companies. Railroads are very expensive, and to help incentivize people to build railroads and expand westward, we're going to see the government get involved, and the government is going to give land grants and bonds to railroad companies. And you're going to see two railroad companies emerge, the Union Pacific Railroad and the Central Pacific Railroad. And we want to form a transcontinental railroad. So you're going to have one railroad starting in the east and one railroad starting in the west, and they're going to meet in the middle. So this is a map that shows you the Central Pacific starting on the west coast, and then the Union Pacific starting in Missouri, and then meeting in the middle. So the government gives a lot of money to the railroads to expand west, but they're also going to help individuals, and they do that through the Homestead Act. This government action helped expansion by giving homesteads to people. It's signed into law by Abraham Lincoln, and it's going to give them land for little or no cost. So you're going to see the emergence of what we call homesteaders out west. And they didn't all build like this. We have this image of log cabins on the west, but the truth of the matter is it was a lot of immigrants taking up these homesteads, and they would build houses out of whatever was available. This particular picture shows a hut out on the plains made out of mud. So the homestead was a huge initiative to get people to move into these new areas. But of course we have a problem because where they're moving, there's people there. There's Native Americans. So as the railroads moved people west, of course, this meant that the people already living in these lands are going to be pushed off. The Native Americans are going to be pushed onto Indian reservations, similar to what we saw with the Trail of Tears. Often the Indians were hustled out of their lands by corrupt government officials or bad deals in general. So maybe the official would go in and say, well, we'll give you this much money for this much land, and then it didn't happen. Stuff like that. So the Dawes-Selverty Act was passed, and it divided the Indian lands and gave it to individual Indian families. And they sort of felt like, well, maybe that was fair. You know, we're taking this land, we're dividing it up, and we're giving it to this head of household and that head of household. But Indians didn't live like that. They didn't live like Westerners, right? They didn't live in individual houses. They lived more communally. And because this is not how they lived and were used to living, they were used to living more communally, more like hunters and gatherers and not as farmers. It was really a bad deal for the Indians. The Native Americans found it harder to keep their traditional lifestyles, and this is also going to be because of the loss of buffalo. If you think about the railroads being put up, and if you have a herd of buffalo crossing in front of a railroad, that poses a really big problem. So as the railroads were being built, the government was actually paying people to come in and kill the buffalo. Well, that hurts the Native Americans because they lived off the buffalo. They were very dependent on the buffalo. The buffalo was used for food and for clothing and for shelter, and so with the absence of buffalo, they also saw their way of life disappearing. So with the dividing up their lands with that Dawes-Selverty Act, and the loss of buffalo, some Native Americans did try to assimilate. So Native American children were taken from their parents and they brought to the East, and they were taught how to learn English and how to be white. Some Indians did not assimilate, and they took to the warpath to reclaim their Indian heritage. And so you're going to see many clashes between the American cavalry, who were sent to protect the white settlers, and the Native Americans. And we call that the Indian Wars. So the Indian Wars, you don't have to remember all the names of those battles, like Battle of Wounded Knee or Custer. Don't get caught up in those rabbit trails. You just need to know that these Indian Wars were not successful for the Native Americans. They often resulted in huge amounts of casualties for the Native Americans, and the Native Americans themselves, they're going to end up in poverty, and you're going to see a cultural decline, and they weren't given a voice in democracy. They weren't given a voice in the new government that's forming. So you don't have to remember all the details, but you need to realize that the wars were not successful for them, and that they were pushed out. So as we expand west, we're going to have an economic boom. During the Civil War and after, America is going to see tremendous amount of growth, and the reasons for this are usually divided into 5 categories. You're going to talk about land. Of course, we just talked about the Homestead Act and moving westward, and the government's role in helping to promote that growth. With the economic boom, we're going to see the government become more and more involved. We're going to see the Supreme Court's going to pass laws that protect business. They're going to get involved in regulating interstate commerce. We're going to see that as we expand, government's going to expand with us. As we expand, we're going to see the development of huge companies, and these huge companies are still developed, and they're going to be run by a few men, and we're going to look at these companies and the few men that ran them, and they're going to accumulate a lot of wealth. And we're going to see, as these men begin taking advantage of this expansion and growing their companies, there's going to start to be a difference between a huge income gap between the wealthy and the working class. It may seem like this is an economics lesson, but we have to sort of pause, because as we expand westward and there's an economic boom, you can't understand an economic boom unless you understand economics. So we need to make sure that you understand what capitalism is. Capitalism, of course, is an economic system where individuals, not the government, own the means of production. So like I can own my store, the government doesn't own it. I can decide to expand, I can decide to shrink, I can fire people. The government doesn't have to tell me what to do. We use the word capitalists to describe the people who use their resources to build these businesses. So businesses during this period of time are going to start to raise money, and they're going to do this through selling of stock, and they're going to do this through large-scale business ventures like the railroads. And capitalism is going to just boom for certain individuals, like Andrew Carnegie. He's going to form the Carnegie Steel Company. Cornelius Vanderbilt, he's going to make money off the railroad. John D. Rockefeller, he's going to develop Standard Oil. So we can see capitalism is a way that sort of expands on this idea of democracy, right? It's very democratic to own your own business and build your own business, and it has this idea of individual freedom. So capitalism and democracy sort of mirror each other. So let's look at some of these people that made huge profits during this time and what they were doing. So Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie is sort of your rags to riches story. He's an immigrant from Scotland. He moved to America for better economic opportunity, and he's going to go on to create the Carnegie Steel Company. And he's going to do this through a process that you need to understand, which is called vertical integration. So steel was in high demand, especially for the making of railroads, and Carnegie realized he could maximize his profits and improve efficiency by owning all parts of the steel making process. So he's going to be beginning to buy everything associated with making the steel. He's going to buy the foundries, he's going to buy the mines, he's going to buy the ships to get it there, he's going to invest in the railroads that get it from one place to another. And that's called vertical integration, when you buy up all the pieces to a company. Again, this may seem like an economics lesson. Companies do that even now. Let's say you are, my husband works for a recycling company, and they're a vertically integrated company. They buy all the copper where he works, and then they take that copper and they own the trucks, and so that take the copper from one place to another, and then they own the foundry that melts down the copper, and then they own the ship that takes the copper to China where they sell it. So it's a vertically integrated company. So through vertical integration, Andrew Carnegie is going to eliminate the middleman, right? And he's going to develop a huge empire. And we've never really seen this before. We've never seen these huge companies. Before, we've just seen small businesses in America. And he's going to become the world's richest man, and he's going to form the first billion-dollar company. So when I was talking about big companies, I was talking about really big companies. I keep forgetting to press the button to show you the pictures of these people. So let's look at another man who sort of represents this time period. Cornelius Vanderbilt. Again, he was not born wealthy, and he's going to be in the railroad business, and he's going to become one of the wealthiest men in America. Sort of, he's during the same time period as Carnegie, so he's got to compete with him for the title. He built his railroad company through what's called horizontal integration, and you have to know what horizontal integration is. He's going to begin buying up smaller companies to form a larger company. So when he came into the business, there were all these smaller railroads, and they weren't owned by one person, and that railroad might connect one city to another city, but then it stopped. And so what Vanderbilt did was he bought up all the smaller companies and he connected them, and he made a larger railroad. So it wasn't that you just got on the train for an hour. Now you could get on the train, get off, get on, and continue. And so by doing this, that's called horizontal integration, when you buy up smaller companies and bring them into your bigger company. Of course, horizontal integration occurs even now. Think of cell phone companies. Verizon buys up Alltel, and then they can use Alltel's towers, that sort of thing. However, when you start gobbling up companies like that, what do you run the risk of? You run the risk of forming a monopoly, right? Like, you're the only railroad company in the business. You can only get your cell phone service from this one company. So suddenly the government's faced with the question of, well, what happens when there's only one company? And the government's going to have to deal with that. So Vanderbilt is very, very wealthy. This is Vanderbilt's house in New York City, and if you've ever been to North Carolina and been to the Biltmore Estates is built. It's that same family. It was not Cornelius, but it's his family that built the Biltmore Estates. So we want to look at what is the government doing during this time of big business. Well, they're protecting it, and the government is very pro-business during this time period. They're going to implement high tariffs, and you definitely need to know what a tariff is. Again, this is like an economics lesson. A tariff is a tax that's put on imported goods. So this is going to protect big business from cheap foreign goods, right? So it's going to encourage domestic people who are manufacturing domestically. Their goods are less than if they're imported from Britain, because you have to pay a tax on that. So they're encouraging the growth of big businesses in America. But what does that do? It eliminates competition, right? It means that if Britain can bring their goods over for cheaper, America doesn't have access to those cheaper goods. So prices are inflated. Prices are going to be more expensive. So it's bad for the consumer, but good for business. You need to know what laissez-faire economics is. Laissez-faire economics just means leave it alone. So the government sort of attitude was hands off, not a lot of regulation, let it do its thing. And companies during this time period are going to take capitalism to the extreme, right? Extreme capitalism means extreme, if taken to the extreme, means the elimination of all competition, right? Because you want to make the most money, and if someone's competing with you, you eliminate it. And sometimes it was by any means necessary. So we're starting to see the development of two different ideas of thought. Businesses as venture capitalists, and they're making the railroads, and of course if you make railroads, that means jobs for the people laying the ties. It means jobs for the people that can get on the railroad and then take their business other places. It means jobs for availability for farmers, for new markets, and all of these homes along the way are going to develop towns. So capitalists provide lots and lots of jobs, but maybe they're not, but they have a darker side too. They're forming monopolies or trusts. And they're eliminating competition, which is raising prices, and maybe these companies aren't treating their workers so well. So the elimination of competition can lead to monopolies, and in this case, a lot of times it did. And so this term we're going to get the Sherman antitrust law, and they use the word trust in the way we use the word monopoly. So the Sherman antitrust law is going to sort of break up some of these monopolies, and it's the first part of first government legislation against business. During this time period, we're going to see the emergence of an evolutionary theory that comes out of biology about where we came from, called Darwinism and his theory of evolution. And basically, if you don't know what it is, it's sort of the survival of the fittest. And capitalists are going to take this idea and apply it to business. This idea that, well, the reason that we survived was because we're better. And they're going to use it sort of as a moral superiority, that reason and behind why they succeeded. So social Darwinism uses this Darwinism theory of evolution and says that the fittest companies survive, just like the fittest animals survive, the fittest companies survive. And since they rose to the top, there's a reason for that. So you need to be familiar with social Darwinism. So even during this time when you might have a gap between the middle class and the lower class, and a huge gap between the lower class and the upper class, there really was a very high standard of living. You were going to see the telephone and the typewriter and electricity and expansion of the railroads. So it really was an exciting time, even if the income gaps were separating. So you need to be familiar with two terms, robber barons or capitalists of industry. And it's really, how do you view this time period? And we sort of, even today, you can sort of think of it today. Do you think of big business as greedy capitalists who use their money to influence the government and increase their own profits? Some people view business that way. Or do you view business as, yes, they have a lot of money, but they make jobs, and, I may not make as much money, but that business allows me to make what I do make. So robber barons is the view that they're greedy capitalists robbing the people, and then of course capitalists of industry is the view that business makes jobs. So why did we start this off by saying this is the Gilded Age? Gilded means that you have an object and you cover it with a very thin layer of gold. And so you can see that we've got this very thin layer of venture capitalists at the top who make a lot of money, and they're covering sort of this much seedier, impoverished underclass, right? Because the gap is so big. So that's why they call this particular time period the Gilded Age, because they feel like there's a few people at the top covering up that smaller layer of cheap labor, like it's gilded. So this time period, we want to look at these. We've looked at the upper class, so now let's look at sort of the middle and poorer classes of society. You're going to, of course, have your farmers. They're very important, but they had their problems, so let's look at them first. So we talked about the railroads and the development of big business, and how big business was developed with the railroads. And as we move west, that's going to open up all this land for farming, right? There are going to be some amazing farming developments. You're going to have the steel plow. Mechanization is going to bring the reaper, which helps with plowing. It allows farmers to produce surplus of cash crops. People are going to be able to use the railroads to transport whatever it is they farm. Pigs, cows, whatever it is, they can use their railroads to get their goods to market. But here again is your economics lesson. You need to understand supply and demand. So as farmers are opening up more land for farming and they're supplying more, they supply more than demand. So what happens when you have a surplus? What happens when there's too many bagels at the store and nobody's buying them? Well, the price goes down, right? There's a sale. So if there's too many pigs and nobody to buy the bacon, they have to cut their prices. Well, farmers take out huge loans. They take out a lot of loans on the front end and they have to pay them back. So with cheap prices, they're not able to pay back their loans for the land and the machinery and startup piglets, whatever. So what do? They start producing more because they didn't understand supply and demand, I guess. So they produce more, which drives the price down even further. Who are they going to blame? Well, they blame the railroads because they are charging high prices to ship their goods to market. So the great thing about America is farmers are going to get together and they're going to send people to Washington to lobby the government to help them fight high railroad costs. They want the railroads to lower their prices for shipping. And because the federal government realizes that cheap prices for food, if farmers just foreclose and stop producing, then that could cause some problems. So they really want to help the farmers, and so they start looking into, well, can we regulate the shipping rates between these different areas? But the problem is railroads go between states, and the federal government doesn't have the power to regulate traffic between North Carolina and South Carolina. So they're going to pass what's called the Interstate Commerce Act. And the Interstate Commerce Act basically says that the government can regulate trade between states, and in doing this, they're going to be able to help the farmers control prices. So the Interstate Commerce Act is going to be something good that comes out of this time period, and it's government regulation. So we see the government getting involved a little bit more. So that's farmers. But what about laborers, people who work in the city, in the mills, and in manufacturing? So during this time, laborers are going to come together just like the farmers did, and they're going to work to improve their conditions. And of course, laborers are going to face long hours. They're working in unsafe work conditions. They get paid really low wages. And again, it's this problem of supply and demand. You have a huge amount of immigrants coming into America. They're unskilled, so they work in factories. Well, if you have a lot of labor, you can afford to pay people cheaply because it's better to get paid $2 than no dollars. And you see this sort of attitude of treating the people in the factories like cogs in a wheel that are just cogs in a machine that are just replaceable, right? Oh, you can't work today? Well, then you can leave and I'll hire someone else, because they had a huge surplus of labor. So in the 1890s, about 45% of the unskilled workforce was earning below the poverty line. So they're going to join together and they're going to start to unionize. So early efforts to unionize and improve working conditions are not going to be all that effective. Managers are going to can use immigrants to replace the workers that go on strike because there's such a huge supply of labor. These people that come in and break the picket line or break the strikes are going to be called scabs. The government during this time is going to take the side of business and not the worker. And that, of course, again sort of gives this idea of businesses being sort of greedy, and that robber baron image as the government takes their side and not the side of labor. Sometimes the protests and the efforts to unionize turned violent, and especially as with the Hayward affair. The Hayward massacre is a riot, and they were striking for an 8-hour workday. That doesn't sound too unreasonable. During the strike, someone threw a bomb and it killed several workers and police, wounded a lot of people. People were put on trial, and just like today, people love trials, and it was highly publicized, and the news and people began to link unions with violence and with socialism, this idea of collective fighting against business, and with anarchism. So the timing was not right. Early labor unions are not going to see a lot of success, but they were fighting for things that are going to come up later, because they did need better working conditions, and they needed for it to be a fair situation. And if you don't know what inflation is, we'll have to pause for a moment and talk about what inflation is. So, inflation is when your dollar doesn't buy as much. So, for example, 10 years ago, you might have been able to buy a gallon of gas for $1. And then because of inflation, that same gallon of gas now costs you $3. So your money's not worth as much. Well, why would farmers want that? One, it drives up prices. It means that people are paying them more dollars for the food, and they need that money to pay off debt. Their debt doesn't change, right? Let's say they have $100 in debt. Well, they can sell one bushel for $2 or one bushel for $5. That same $5 will pay off the same amount of debt. So it's pretty simple. Inflation drives up prices and allows them to pay off debt. So what they see is that they can back the Populist Party, because the Populist Party wants to switch from the gold standard, where your money is guaranteed by gold, to silver, and they want to have unlimited printing of money backed by silver. So the farmers are going to join the Populist Party. The populist movement did have some other reforms that appealed to laborers. They wanted more direct intervention in government. They want your senators to be elected directly. They wanted term limits for the president. And so the laborers are going to sort of join the populist movement as well. But we're going to see that they don't exactly they're not as rigid. It's more fluid for them. So the election of 1896 is going to come to a head between this idea of soft money, money that's not backed by gold or silver, versus hard money, which is backed by gold or silver. You're also going to get this idea of farmers versus cities. And the reason I say farmers versus cities is because people who live in the city don't want to see inflation, right? They have to pay rent and they have to pay for food, and so they don't want to see that their dollar doesn't buy them as much. They don't want to see that they can't buy, instead of buying 2 dozen carrots, they're buying 1 dozen carrot for the same amount of money. You're going to see this idea of farmers and laborers versus banks and business. So William Jennings Bryan is going to run on the populist ticket, and he's going to appeal to the farmers. And he's an amazing orator. He gives amazing speeches. He's going to give a speech called the Cross of Gold speech, which demands that gold be removed from the dollar and be backed by silver. So of course he gets the populist nomination, but he also gets the Democratic nomination. Of course, this again proves that third parties don't really ever exist very long in America. So William McKinley is going to run on the Republican ticket, and he is heavily backed with a lot of money from banks and from businesses, and he will win. And this is important because this shows the support for big business and the support for banks, and they're a huge amount of influence. And this will be the last time that farmers are ever targeted as a voting bloc. So we're going to end here with the election of 1896 and the issue of money and whether the dollar should be backed by silver and gold is going to be dropped. But some of the other progressive movements, like better working hours, safer working conditions, all of that is going to be taken up in the next lesson by the Progressive Party. So I want to give you a reading check just to make sure that you are watching these presentations. So if Carnegie is the capitalist for steel and Vanderbilt is the capitalist for railroads, there were others, and you need to be vaguely familiar with that Rockefeller, of course of Rockefeller Center, he's going to get his money from oil. He's going to form the Standard Oil Company, and then the capitalist for banks would be J.P. Morgan. So the question is, who were the capitalists for oil, and who was the capitalist for banking?